Okay.
All right, looks like we're live.
All right, looks like we're live. Hey everyone, this is Christian Espinosa. I'm the founder of Blue Goat Cyber. We have Trevor here. He's our director of medical device cybersecurity. And this morning we're going to cover risk management principles. Trevor's going to do most of the talking. Trevor's coming live from Mexico, and I'm live from Phoenix. I just got back from Dubai last night, so I think I'm a little bit jet lagged. I think Trevor's bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, or whatever they say. So you want to kick us off, Trevor?
Definitely. Yeah, I'm a little bit, I've been on the Mexico time zone for a little while now, so kind of used to it. All right. So a lot of what we're looking at here.
It's not 14 hours different from where I am, though. It's like 1 hour, right? So
Yeah, it's just an hour from, Phoenix to Merida, so not too big of a deal to make that switch.
Cool.
All right, so a lot of what we're looking at here is going to be the intersection between safety and security with risk management, how they can be separate but in distinct processes, and how they can also be sort of connected processes. All right, so there are a couple of different frameworks and different considerations when looking between safety and security. So under the context of FDA risk management, so what the FDA wants to see for a medical device, the two critical risk management frameworks should be ISO 14971 for safety risk management and AAMI TIR57 for security risk management. These should be distinct processes, meaning you can't just have one risk management framework to dump any problem into and get the appropriate outcome. There should be a safety risk management that's focused on the potential for harm to a patient, and a security risk management, which is focused more on data safety and total product lifecycle considerations. Despite the fact that these are separate, it's pretty easily apparent how there can be some overlap here. If there is a problem with data safety or TPLC consideration that can introduce a vulnerability into a medical device, that is very often going to introduce harm into a patient. So having a clear distinction between these two processes, but also a little bit of a way for them to bleed into each other, can be pretty important to make sure that we're covering everything as far as safety and security overlap. These two risk management frameworks are very similar from their flow. TIR57 is based on 14971, and so it's pretty apparent reading through the process that they follow. It's just more focused on a different outcome. So AAMI TIR57 advises for the creation of distinct processes that share that overlap that we're talking about. If a security-related issue bleeds into a safety categorization, that's usually going to come in during the risk evaluation phase. So when we're assessing a risk, seeing what the potential impact could be, if that potential impact from a security perspective is that there could be potential harm to a patient, that's when it would get fed into that ISO 14971 safety risk management framework. So throughout this entire risk management cycle, the risk evaluation phase is typically when that's going to be identified. That's during the initial phase, during the risk assessment. As soon as that's identified and it's fed into the other risk management framework, corrective action can begin in the form of a security risk control or a safety risk control. Very often, if there is a problem that does overlap into both areas, a fix from one would fix both. So if there's a security issue that can potentially cause patient harm, and that's identified during the risk evaluation phase, a security risk control is often all that's going to be needed. You will not necessarily need both security and safety risk controls separately to protect the device. This is not always the case. Sometimes it's better to have separate controls under each separate process, but this can be on a case-by-case basis. The next thing to look at is what is a level of acceptable risk. So there can be thousands, if not more, findings in a device, and being able to appropriately triage them is a very important process. So understanding what meets acceptability criteria and defining that acceptability criteria early on is very important to make sure that nothing is really just slipping out, nothing is making it into the device that can potentially harm a patient in a major way, but also that it's not going to be so strict that nothing makes it through that criteria. And so relatively insignificant findings take a lot of corrective action that may be better off put elsewhere. So understanding that risk acceptance criteria is a pretty important thing. The outcome of all of this is going to be a risk management report. When we're looking at a medical device, the FDA has some guidelines that we'll get into on what a risk management report should contain, in addition to just the outcome of any of these risk assessment and risk analysis activities. All right, so when we're creating the connection between safety and security, it's a pretty important evaluation. Understanding the analysis of how corrective action impacts it is a very important thing that may often be overlooked. So aside from just understanding that the safety problem has a security impact or vice versa, understanding how fixing one or the other is going to impact the opposite is very important as well. Oftentimes a corrective action can create increased risk on the other. This is especially common if you have a safety risk and a corrective action may impose an additional security risk. So there should be sort of regression testing anytime there's a fix to a problem to make sure that that problem is properly gone and it did not introduce any new vulnerabilities. Each is going to likely have a different outcome from the other as far as an impact. So there could be a safety and security risk problem. And from a security perspective, it's a high severity issue, top priority, something that needs to be fixed immediately. From safety, it would be maybe a low minor inconvenience problem, still present, but not anything that requires all hands on deck situation. When that's the case, typically there's going to be a process for prioritization of different findings. And so understanding how to properly triage between security and safety at the same time is going to be a valuable thing to keep in mind. When that has two different...
I have a quick question here, Trevor. For clarity, when we're doing a cybersecurity assessment of a device, you're saying we have to consider safety, which affects the patient, and security, which is basically the data, it sounds like. And for a prioritization, like you were talking about from a risk perspective, it sounds like the safety is a higher impact than security or the data. Is that correct?
If we're looking at the perspective through the FDA and in general the perspective that we should follow, the FDA's biggest concern is around patient safety and patient data loss. So if we have a very high severity security impact, but it's not necessarily going to harm the patient or not necessarily going to lead to patient's data getting disclosed, it's not as big of a deal if we have, as opposed to if we have a very high risk from a safety perspective. So in general, safety is going to be the bigger priority from the FDA. Both are very important, but if we have a high security risk and a high safety risk, usually the safety risk is going to take priority. Now, oftentimes there can be a single risk with different impacts on either, and so understanding which is the appropriate one to prioritize, usually going to be safety, is an important skill to have.
Cool. It sounds like this is from a traditional cybersecurity perspective, are mainly concerned about security, but here safety, it sounds like, is a higher priority.
Yeah, and that's usually the case that can lead to a lot of issues when submitting into the FDA is traditional cybersecurity teams are focused on traditional cybersecurity. So they're going to be familiar with security risk management. Likely they will not be familiar with safety risk management. They're similar processes, but they're different. So understanding what the difference between them is going to be really an important skill for anyone who is getting into a medical device security consideration. It's not always going to be just cut and dry between, what is actually going to be a problem with safety. It's a little bit more difficult to understand than security. Security has some more established frameworks, But safety just requires some careful analysis and experience on that outcome. All right, so when we're looking at the risk management report, there are some FDA recommendations for what should enter that. This is going to cover both different frameworks and how they can sort of interact with each other. This is mostly focused on cybersecurity, but again, we're looking at the impact to a patient here. So the first step of this is going to be threat modeling, and this is essentially just going to follow down the typical flow of a risk management framework. Threat modeling should be the first thing done under a risk assessment in general. That is sort of exploring the hypotheticals of what could happen and trying to bake in security considerations early on. Threat modeling is not something that should be one and done. It should be done early and often, and it should be very comprehensive. There should be a lot of review through that threat modeling. Proper threat modeling is going to catch vulnerabilities before they ever make their way into the system, so it's a very important first step, and it's something that should be part of a cyclical process. Next should be a cybersecurity risk assessment. So risk assessments are going to be focused more on actualized risks. It's things that have made their way into the system despite any corrective measures built in already. These are usually going to be identified through different forms of testing, penetration testing, static code testing, things of that nature. And those vulnerabilities identified will go through a risk assessment. This is also where we need to identify that acceptability criteria. So understanding what is going to be an okay level of risk and what is not is a very important first step as part of that risk assessment. Once we identify what is acceptable, things that are unacceptable need to be designed out of the system pretty quickly. Anything that is acceptable can just be logged and stored, and we'll get to that as part of the unresolved anomalies. One thing that the FDA is specifically concerned about is the software bill of materials. There can be a lot of risk introduced through the supply chain. So the FDA wants to make sure that any of these risks are carefully accounted for and fed into that risk assessment, and software bill of materials itself is logged as part of risk management. One thing that is not as common with SBOM considerations is component support. This is something very important to the FDA and is becoming a more prevalent consideration in other industries, though it is still relatively new. So a lot of developers will just try to find any solution to a problem they can, even if that means it's an unsupported GitHub project that has seen no development in the past 4 years and only has 3 stars. As long as it meets their requirement, they'll use it. That can be a pretty dangerous situation. If that component has a vulnerability, it's likely not going to be fixed, since we've seen that it hasn't had any development in 4 years. There isn't a strong community backing it, and there aren't strong development efforts to make sure that it's secure, to make sure that it's well maintained. If that's the case, then it's likely that nothing is going to be remediated, vulnerabilities will make their way into the system, or that component could be breached altogether. So having a good process to track any components used in the system is a key component of risk management. Vulnerability assessments are another thing that should be conducted. Vulnerability assessments can be thought of as kind of a quick and fast scope across a device to make sure that any vulnerabilities are quickly identified and quickly fed into that risk assessment. So it's very important to have that as part of that cyclical process, and everything feeds back into that risk assessment and ultimately the risk controls. Finally, one thing we're looking at is unresolved anomaly assessments. This covers 2 areas with regards to a medical device. The first being an assessment of previously identified anomalies in the device. So an anomaly is usually going to cover a software anomaly. That'll be a bug or a strange behavior that is not designed out of the system and is just accepted as something that happens. While this can be fine from just a software perspective, of course, everyone wants to have minimal bugs in their code. But from a security perspective, oftentimes these anomalies can introduce some risk. So feeding all of these anomalies into the risk assessment process and identifying what the outcome can be, both from security and safety, is really important. The second area that this can come into play is any findings that meet that acceptability criteria and are going to remain in the system as an outcome of that risk assessment eventually become an anomaly in the system. It's very important to log these and make sure that these are tracked. So if the outcome increases in the future, let's say this gets escalated from a low to a medium or a high because of some changing factors like exploit code getting released to the public. That would increase the risk of the vulnerability. So tracking these, making sure that they are carefully monitored and reviewed frequently is a very important component of risk management. What the FDA wants to see in a risk management report is essentially a snapshot of how all of these activities are performed to make sure that they are performed up to relevant standards and they are performed up to relevant detail. So there is nothing that's slipping through the crack. Nobody's forgetting to evaluate their SBOM. Nobody is forgetting to have a proper risk assessment framework and an acceptability criteria in there. So it should essentially just cover all of these in a high-level summary and then reference out to the details of what is performed under each activity. So while those are the main components, there are some secondary components that can be very helpful to have in a risk management report as well. Risk management report should summarize risk evaluation methods and processes. Now, what this is usually going to mean is how you are scoring risk. There could be a lot of different risk scoring frameworks. One of the most common ones from a security perspective is going to be CVSS. While this is great under that security lens, it is exploring three main areas for the impact. That's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Those are very important metrics to still consider. However, notably, it's missing patient harm. So when assessing risk, it's important to have something that is taking that patient harm into consideration. It is not just focused on traditional cybersecurity metrics. While those are still very important to have, they can be very helpful. It's easy to see how availability could be a problem within a device. If it is no longer functional, if it no longer works, that could deny treatment to a patient. Same with confidentiality. Protecting patient data is very important. But keeping security and safety, most importantly, at the front of any of these evaluations is paramount. So understanding that the safety of the patient is the number one consideration is very important. Now, there are some standardized safety risk assessment methodologies that are covered by the FDA and part of ISO 14971, but there are not really any standardized frameworks that cover both security and safety. So having a method to evaluate them carefully can be good, and it often needs to be developed internally. Typically, what we look at is a blend of CVSS for that exploitability metric, and then modifying the impact metric to instead look at how it can harm a patient. So that's meeting both of the needs of what the FDA wants to see. They want to see something standardized for a risk evaluation method, and they also want to see it consider patient safety. Another very important thing to have in a risk management report is understanding the risk conclusion. So after everything happens with the security risk assessment, we'll say that there are 5 findings remaining. All of these 5 findings they meet acceptability criteria alone, meaning that individually they do not increase the risk to the device or to the patient. Now, there can be a chance that in combination they could increase the risk to the patient. So the outcome of the whole risk assessment should be evaluated pretty carefully. Everything that is fixed should be documented, so there should be a little snapshot of what was identified and what was remediated. And then what was not remediated needs to have that rationale and that justification. So everything individually does not impose risk to the patient, and then everything in combination does not impose risk to the patient. The risk mitigation activities are very important to document as well. These are going to be the risk controls. So depending on what the finding is, this can cover safety or security. Sometimes it covers both at once, as we had touched up on before. But essentially, it's any corrective action to make sure that a problem is designed out of the system. This can be either a change in a process or an overall design change in the device. It depends on the individual finding, and there is often no one-size-fits-all solution for a finding. There can be several different solutions depending on what the problem is. All of these should be documented and snapshotted for each individual finding and then the device as a whole. These can be tied not only to findings out of the risk assessment, but also to that initial threat modeling exercise that we're doing. If there's a control that's designed early on into the device that prevents a vulnerability from ever making its way into the system, that would be something important to document as a secure control there. The final thing that the FDA wants to see in this report is traceability between everything. Now, typically, this is a little bit of a difficult area for a lot of engineering teams to understand, since traceability from this perspective is very different from traceability from a development perspective. Typically, traceability matrices are seen as something that ties an initial software requirement to the outcome. So saying the device needs to have X functionality, and then there's a test to verify that functionality is in place and the outcome of the test. That's the traceability that is typically thought of. And very often when the FDA is asking for traceability, that's what's provided by engineering teams. What the FDA is looking for is something to tie in the threat model, risk assessment, testing, and outcomes. So we have these initial potential threats from the threat model. We think about what could happen to the device. We perform any of the testing to identify what can actually happen to the device, the risk assessment to triage these findings that were identified, and then ultimately the controls and outcome of any of these vulnerabilities. If vulnerabilities were identified that are acceptable, then we have a clear explanation for why they can remain in their system, a quick summary of what that residual risk is, and what the potential problems could be. If a vulnerability is designed out of the system, we have clear traceability between how we identified that problem and then ultimately the mitigation and how it is removed entirely from the system. So having that end-to-end traceability throughout every process of the risk management framework is very important and can be very helpful. So there can be a lot of different things that are going to provide input for a traceability matrix. Inbound vulnerability collection can happen in a lot of different ways. And while this is not an exhaustive list, this can be a great place to start. So static testing is often something that should be put in very early and by any engineering team. Static testing is looking at the code to try to identify vulnerabilities as they come up through development practices. So this would be something like insecure coding that is going to cause memory problems in the device. And very often this can catch vulnerabilities before they're caught by a penetration tester or even worse, by a threat actor. So static testing is a great first layer of defense. Now, dynamic testing is going to be similar. That's automated tooling that essentially acts as a penetration tester or a threat actor. It is going to cover a lot of ground quickly and look for surface level vulnerabilities. Usually it's not going to dive in quite as deep as it may be through a typical penetration test, but it can be a great first look. Now, what the purpose of dynamic testing is going to be is A, to look for anything that slipped through the cracks of static testing, and B, look for things that static testing can't usually find. An example would be like a race condition, where if two events happen at the same time or very close to the same time, the outcome of one can affect the other in a negative way. Static testing is not going to identify that. That's not a coding problem, that's a design problem. So dynamic testing is going to look for design problems similar to penetration testing. The next thing, we touched up on this briefly before, but it's going to be the SBOM analysis. So looking at any components in the software bill of materials and what vulnerabilities they may have is very important. If there is a finding in the SBOM, there needs to be a way to either put a consideration around it, put a control around it, or design it out of the system entirely. This can be done in a few different ways. This can just be by updating the component. Sometimes there's not an update available, which is why it's very important to look at that SBOM level of support, which we touched up on before. If there is an actively supported project, usually there will be an update available. In the case that there isn't, though, there should be some corrective action, whether that's forking the project yourself or finding an alternative solution. Next thing that we're looking at is vulnerability assessments and penetration testing. So this is going to be just a more typical security approach, looking with a human on a keyboard, trying to find ways into the device, trying to hack into the system from the outside. This is going to most closely simulate a threat actor and try to identify all the problems that a threat actor could find. And it's going to be the most comprehensive. Usually this is something that needs to be an ongoing effort. All of these should be an ongoing effort, but the penetration testing is going to cover the most problems and identify the most findings in most cases. The next thing that we're going to want to look at, and this is usually not something that will happen in the early phases, so not something that's going to identify problems before submission and before clearance by the FDA, but coordinated vulnerability disclosures. So this is when public security researchers are looking for problems and they're identifying them as they come up and reporting it to the manufacturer. It's an FDA requirement to have a process in place for this coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So bringing this information in and then appropriately triaging it is important. Now, one thing that is notably different with CVD as opposed to some of these other vulnerability collection methods, CVD reports are not always going to be very accurate. So very often there can be a security researcher who thinks they found a problem, but they don't understand the functionality of the device as well as a penetration tester who sat down with the development team or the development team themselves. So they say that they found this problem. They say that this functionality isn't working the way it's intended when it really is. Having a proper triage process to evaluate whether or not these are legitimate findings is very important. And then ultimately feeding any of these legitimate findings into that risk assessment should be the next step. The next thing that we want to look at is external vulnerability sources. So an easy example for this is the FDA cybersecurity notifications. This is going to look at industry cybersecurity trends and vulnerabilities as they pop up. CISA alerts is another great one. That's the Center of Infrastructure and Security. They have a lot of great information on what threat actors are doing in the wild. They keep a lot of lists on most commonly exploited findings and different techniques and tactics that hackers are using to try to compromise devices. And then there can be a lot of different medical device specific services that are looking at medical devices in general, trying to see what trends are happening, talking about problems that pop up in different devices, and then trying to notify the public of the best way to move about security based on these findings. So these different sources can also vary pretty heavily depending on the device. There can often be sources specifically for different components in the device. So identifying the manufacturer of a microcontroller and then subscribing to their security notifications can be a great way to get some external vulnerability collection in. If there's a vulnerability that pops up in that microcontroller or the manufacturer identifies a design problem, you'll be notified through that means, while it may not typically be notified through other medical device means. All right, now the final thing that is important to consider here is essentially covering everything for an audit, or the way that we like to put it is audit proofing. So risk management processes should be created and reflected internally to not only share to the FDA, but to cover any of the internal process that is happening. The FDA does not explicitly ask you for that risk management framework when you're submitting in for a 510K or for a PMA, de novo, whatever it is. What they want is the risk management report. Now, if that risk management report is prepared for the FDA, but the risk management framework is not prepared internally, that'll raise questions in the event of an audit, or if someone does ask to see that risk management report. So anything that is covered to create that outcome should be done internally as a clear process. Some very important things is that risk management frameworks should follow the same steps, meaning there shouldn't be any just ad hoc assessments of findings or vulnerabilities. It should always be a very clear and documented flow. It should start with that initial risk evaluation, move its way through the risk assessment, and then ultimately move into the risk controls. Anything that is not remediated should be fed into that unresolved anomaly register. This should be a very clear and determined process. This should not vary too much. Risk assessments should occur at a minimum annually with greater frequency based on major changes or extreme circumstances. Now, a major change is usually going to cover any design alterations from a significant perspective. If we have, let's say, we're switching out one Bluetooth library for another, and it doesn't change the operation of the device, usually that's not going to be a major change. We'd still want to track that. We want to evaluate it through supply chain security considerations, but it's not going to require a full new risk assessment, new penetration testing, all of that. What would be a major change is taking an air-gapped device and connecting it to the internet. That would be pretty significant. That would require new risk assessment, new activities. That would require the start to finish process to be redone. So new threat modeling, new risk assessment, new controls. Additionally, while that's not covered as part of a risk management framework, that would usually require a new submission into the FDA as well. And then an extreme circumstance could be identification of a breach So a major security event happening that requires corrective action. How did this event happen? How did this slip through the previous time? All of that should be figured out, and all of that should warrant a new risk assessment. All right, that's everything I had on these slides. Wanted to check in with you, Christian, see if you had any, additional thoughts on this topic.
Hey, Trevor, did you have anything else to go over here? I think you just passed along to me. I don't know if it's my internet connection or yours, but you disappeared for a second. We do have a few questions from the audience, so I'd like to bring those up if you're back online. You can hear me okay.
Yeah, let's take a look at those. And then I just wanted to see if you had any additional thoughts on the matter, and then we can go over some of those questions.
Cool. I don't have any additional thoughts. I think you covered things very well. I think we'll get some more clarity from the questions. I've got, I think there's 4 questions that popped up during the webinar here. One of the first ones is, and you kind of talked about it a little bit, was the overarching thing here is risk management, but somebody asked, like, what's the difference in risk assessment versus risk management? I think, the purpose of this webinar is about risk management, but I guess for clarity, how does risk assessment tie into risk management? That's really the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And oftentimes that distinction can be a little bit fuzzy. It's important to draw the line, but essentially risk assessments are just part of an overall risk management framework. So that's during that initial risk evaluation phase. A risk assessment is taking a look at any individual problem and then trying to figure out what the outcome of it could be. So the input into a risk assessment is going to be a vulnerability, the exploitability of that vulnerability, and then the outcome is usually going to be the impact of that vulnerability. Once that impact is identified, it gets fed into the next steps of an overall risk management framework. So that's usually going to be looking at the controls that can mitigate that problem, either by reducing the impact or reducing the exploitability factors, most commonly reducing the exploitability factors. But in short, risk assessments are just one part of an overall risk management framework, essentially looking at scoring a vulnerability.
Okay, cool. The other question is about qualitative versus quantitative. I don't know if you really covered those two kind of methods for risk assessment. You kind of alluded a little bit towards quantitative, I think, but yeah, the question is really, what's the preferred method for medical devices, quantitative or qualitative?
Probably one of the more common things that we see in deficiency notices from the FDA is your risk assessment methodology uses qualitative methods or language such as probability or likelihood. Probability can be very difficult to define. And so if we pick any one problem, I might say it has a 1 in 100 chance of occurring, and you might say it has 1 in 1,000 chance of occurring. And if we're not able to provide a clear justification on that number, then it's essentially just saying, leave it up to my assessment of it. What the FDA wants to see is very clear objective metrics. And so this is why, when I've been talking about scoring a risk assessment, we talk about exploitability as the preferred metric. Exploitability looks at objective factors, such as, does this require user interaction? Do you physically have to be touching the device, or can you do it over the internet? Things like that. And then you can feed that into a calculation to get an overall score and use that score as part of your risk assessment. CBSS has great exploitability metrics. And I know we talked about CBSS as a good method for security risk assessments. While it does not have the proper considerations for safety on the impact side of things, for the exploitability factors, it is a great way to have that consideration in mind.
Okay, awesome. Another question is about basically the person's asking, what about NIST? I don't think you mentioned NIST. You mentioned ISO and AAMI TIR, but NIST is like considered the standard for cybersecurity. So the person is asking about NIST standards in relationship to medical device cybersecurity.
Yeah, there can be a lot of great standards provided by NIST, specifically around risk assessment. For risk management frameworks in general, the specifically called out ones by the FDA are ISO 14971 and TIR 57. So NIST doesn't necessarily play into overall risk management, but a lot of the different NIST risk assessment methodologies, and then information tracked by NIST. I know NIST had a pretty big hand in CDSS as well, so they can definitely play into the risk assessment side of things.
Okay. Awesome. One last question we received was about does this risk management framework we're talking about apply to other regulatory organizations like MDR is what they asked versus just FDA?
The MDR, this would apply, and it can be on a case-by-case basis. So in general, ISO 14971 and TIR 57 are seen as some of the golden standards. And that's part of IEC 81001-5, which is seen as kind of the global medical device regulatory standard. These are specifically referenced. Now, each country has its own considerations. Like China and Korea have a little bit of a different methodology than the rest of the world. But some of the other major bodies, so Japan, USA, Europe, Singapore, tends to follow a little bit more of this standardized process. Now, that's not to say specifically that China and Korea don't accept these risk management frameworks, but they often have some different considerations and they want to see different things as far as the risk assessment methodology and acceptability criteria.
Okay, awesome. That was all the questions we had. I think you did a great job covering overall risk management. What's the topic we're discussing on our next webinar in January?
All right, so the next thing that we're going to take a look at is a little bit more detail on how risk assessments work. So we covered it at a high level, but we're going to dive into some of those deeper considerations and get more into the weeds on how risk assessment can be performed.
Okay. All right, rock and roll. Awesome. I think managing risk is part of life, not just medical device cybersecurity. I know you manage risk when you climb up peaks and stuff, do your rock climbing. I manage it every day, like when I'm traveling, when I'm doing a triathlon, or when I'm climbing a mountain. So it's an important topic. I think a lot of people need to understand. And I think one of the misconceptions is there's this idea that we can eliminate all risk, but we have to get risk to an acceptable level. I think it's impossible to eliminate all risk unless you just don't do that activity or don't sell the product, basically. You agree with that?
Definitely. And I think that's why they call it risk management instead of risk removal. There's always going to be some level of risk, and it needs to be managed and it needs to be considered, but understanding, an acceptable level of risk. So when you're going rock climbing, there's always some risk, but use a rope, use a harness, use a helmet, and then you aren't going to get too hurt. So understanding how to manage that risk while still using a device that can potentially change lives, still having a fun activity, can be a delicate balance, but once you find that balance, it can be pretty great.
Yeah, I don't think my risk appetite is as high as Alex Honnold climbing El Capitan with nothing, just free solo. But that's the other thing. We all have different risk appetites. His is pretty high compared to mine.
Yep. Yeah, I like climbing. I don't like that kind of climbing. I like to walk away from climbing.
Yeah, one mistake and could be over. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. We will join you next month when we do a little bit deeper dive, as Trevor mentioned, on risk assessments, which is a component of risk management. And have a great holiday.